So you get in Christian theology the principle, and certainly in the ministry of Jesus, the principle of non-retaliation, the view that violence begets violence, the view that resorting to violence in the end degrades both all who participate in it, and the growing theology that the only way forward is to solve problems at the level of the causes of violence. In other words, a violence is always a symptom of deeper underlying causes, and the important thing to do is to discover what those underlying causes are. And it's interesting that for the first 300 years of the Church's existence, there was a fairly consistent witness to this pacifist commitment. It runs parallel with the conviction that you have to witness also to justice. So it's not a weakness. And you do whatever you have to do to fight injustice without resorting to violence. And therefore, of course, the classic illustrations of this are Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, and Mahatma Gandhi, of course, cited Jesus as an example of somebody who was committed to non-violence in his protests against the rule of the British in India. The second position came much later. This is the view that for the sake of justice and peace, it is sometimes necessary to resort to war. And of course this arises with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in 340 or so. And at that point you had the Holy Roman Empire being predominantly Christian, and it invited Christian theologians then to think through for the first time a theology of statehood. And the crucial person in this drama is St. Augustine of Hippo from northern Africa, who lived 354 to 430 CE. And in his masterpiece, The City of God, he sketches out the basics of what became known as the just war tradition. Augustine's source, of course, was the Hebrew Bible and a crucial verse in Romans chapter 13. But the Hebrew Bible gives plenty of illustrations of God sanctioning war, and so he took that seriously. And Romans 13 teaches that all rulers are appointed by God. So we combine the two together to argue that you are permitted to resort to war under two conditions. The first is if it's got legitimate authority, i.e. a ruler appointed by God requires or instructs you to fight. The second reason is if there's a just cause. You're not allowed to just do it because the leader desires to expand his empire. You've got to do it in self-defense or to protect those others who are weaker. This whole tradition of the just war tradition developed in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican friar, who added the requirement that there must be right intention. And by right intention, he insisted the ultimate goal of all war and all violence must be to create peace. And it must be the only way you can get to that peace is through violence. The tradition in the 20th century has now developed with some 7 conditions, which have of course shaped international law. And those 7 conditions are, firstly, the just cause, which we've already mentioned, derived from Augustine. Secondly, legitimate authority. Thirdly, the right intention, derived from Aquinas, to create peace. And the last 4 developed in the 16th and 17th century through mainly Roman Catholic jurisprudence specialists. All other means of rectifying the injustice must have been exhausted. That's condition number 4. In other words, you must have exhausted all other ways of trying to overcome the problem of injustice, diplomatic sanctions, whatever, before you resort to war. The 5th condition is you've got to have a reasonable hope of winning. The just war tradition does not justify or permit anybody to enter into a hopeless war. Why? Because in the end, the consequences are just bloodshed and death. You've always got to be sure that ultimately a just peace can materialize as a result of embarking on the violence. The sixth condition is that the manner of conducting the war must be legitimate. And here, of course, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants is important. You've got to discriminate. Women and children make no difference to the result of a war. They are always the victims in the war, where troops sweep over and move back and forth. The combatants are the important people, and therefore you're only legitimately allowed to use violence against combatants. And finally, war must always be fought using proportional means. In other words, must not use a disproportionate reaction to the injustice. Falkland Islands were invaded by the Argentinians. It clearly would have been disproportionate for Britain to have used a nuclear weapon against Buenos Aires or the capital of Argentina. What then are the implications for global peace and justice arising from these two positions for our discussion? And I want to suggest there are three. The first is that the Christian tradition always believes, both the just war tradition and certainly the pacifist tradition, believes that violence should always be the last resort. You should never move to violence as the way forward if there are other options available. Linked to that, second, all other alternatives should be explored and re-explored and tried again in a quest to reach a just settlement. And then finally, there is an obligation in the Christian tradition derived from Judaism and certainly in the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth that Christians are obliged to work for a just society. And the basic components of a just society are the recognition of human rights. Human rights terminology is a modern language. It has its roots in post-Enlightenment Western thought, but it clearly has its insights derived from the teaching of the 7th century prophets of Israel, the teaching of Jesus, and importantly the natural law tradition as it evolved in the Roman Catholic Church. The principle that all people are created in the image of God and therefore should be respected, both in terms of negative human rights, i.e. free to worship, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but also positive human rights. The basic entitlement to the necessities of life, to food, to shelter, to work. A further feature of a just society from a Christian perspective is equality of opportunity, especially for the poor. There is in Christian theology an obligation that society includes all. And one difficulty for the Christian is that it's difficult to read the New Testament and feel comfortable being affluent. The themes of Jesus' teaching around wealth are clear, that wealth can be a hindrance to the kingdom of God. And therefore, a just society must enable all to participate. A further feature of a just society from a Christian perspective is a framework of law and order, where there is an understanding that transactions will be respected and that there is appropriate regulation and structure in society. And finally, there must always be a welfare safety net or some sort of support mechanism to enable those who, for whatever reason, find themselves unable to support themselves to be able to survive and cope with the adversity that they are temporarily, one trusts, having to endure. So in summary, the Christian tradition sort of has two poles. One, which is pacifist, that in the end it is always wrong to resort to violence, and this is grounded in the teaching of Jesus and was the lifestyle of the early church for the first 300 years. The other is the just war tradition, which emerged after the conversion of Constantine and teaches that only in exceptional circumstances are you allowed to resort to violence, and then there are strict rules about how you then embark on it. This discussion about violence is all linked to the vision that Christians have for a just society, with the priorities being human rights and inclusion. I now invite Ralph Ahlberg to address the situation of America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I'd like to say what a privilege it is to be here. We've enjoyed Pakistan, and we've enjoyed meeting new friends, and we've received wonderful hospitality from many people. I come to this meeting not as an academic, theologian, or scholar. I come as a working pastor. And my particular pathway in Christianity and in Christian service through the ministry is been a fairly activist one. Along with Louise Loomis, I've been active in civil rights. I had the opportunity to chair a committee that brought Martin Luther King to Long Island, and so I've been a part of that tradition. I admire people like William Sloane Coffin, who said that war is a coward's way to peace, a coward's way to peace, that what we need is dialogue and conversation. But this morning I'd like to just talk about, this afternoon, I'd like to talk about the American scene. And the first thing to say is that there's nothing monolithic about American Christianity. We're a very diverse people, and we have a very diverse understanding of our Christian faith. From the very beginning, this was apparent. The Quakers, Puritan, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Roman Catholics, a smattering of Jews. The Peace Church was there in the Quakers. But mostly it was really a time when the nation and the people of the nation were concerned with themselves. The nation was concerned with nation building. The people were concerned with their own pathway to salvation. So a great emphasis was placed upon personal piety, the conversion experience, who would go to heaven and who wouldn't. It was a time when that kind of struggle took place in the minds and hearts of the people. Also, one of the characteristics of the United States was the reality of slavery. Almost from the beginning, there were people who were brought from the African continent and held in bondage, mostly in the southern states, and that created tension between the peoples and within the Christian community. So that, for example, the second president of the United States, John Adams, was very critical of slavery, creating a kind of tension that finally led to the Civil War. But nation building and the western expansion of our nation was really constituted the first part, through the middle of through the 17th, through the beginnings of the 19th century, and into the early 20th century. Isolationism pretty much characterized American life. There was a growing diversity in the 19th century through immigration and industrialization. Henry Ford and the industrialization of America was a very real phenomenon that brought a great wave of immigrants into the country. And again, with those immigrants came a great many Roman Catholic people, and again added to the diversity of the nation. And a division of wealth, so that eventually a movement within Christianity took place that was called the social gospel movement, a movement to begin to address some of the social problems, the poverty that existed in our major cities, Walter Rauschenbusch was an example of one who taught that to be a Christian meant that one was not only concerned about one's personal orientation or pathway to salvation, but to be a Christian meant to be involved in the public sector, to be involved in addressing the problems of the poor. And so that became a very real part of American life. After the Second World War, the isolation of America was challenged by theologians such as Reinhold Niebuhr. He was a theologian of irony. He defined sin as the unintended consequence of well-intentioned action. For example, Niebuhr believed that American isolationism contributed greatly to such consequences as Hitler and the Holocaust. And so he advocated participation in the larger world and being more activistic in terms of representing our Christian faith socially. Since the conclusion of the Second World War and the formation of the World Council of Churches in 1948, there's been a greater involvement of our churches in the world. There's also been a strong division in America between evangelical and fundamentalist churches and more liberal congregate churches. Within the liberal mainline churches, such as the Presbyterian, the Episcopal Church, there's been a shift from an emphasis on missionary work, which began in the 19th century, missionary and conversion, the emphasis upon conversion to Christianity, to an emphasis upon dialogue and service. So that, for example, the people who go out from the United Church of Christ for the last 100 years have not been interested so much in conversion as in service and establishing institutions of learning and hospitals. And that's, I think that represents the style of American liberal Christianity. The 80s and 90s gave rise to the strength of evangelical churches within Christianity, and there are churches that have become increasingly politically involved. George W. Bush, for example, is one who has tapped into this evangelical Christianity because it represents about 30% of American voters. And so it's a very important power base for his own political work and agenda. I think he came to that evangelical Christianity. He's raised within the Episcopal Church, a kind of a mainline church, but out of a personal crisis and his association with Billy Graham, he's tapped into this evangelical Christianity. Currently, the American nation is very much divided on the means to achieving peace. Of course, the position that attracts me is one of greater understanding among the religions, and greater economic justice among the nations, and greater support in my own country for the United Nations as a vehicle and instrument to resolve conflict and dispute. Finally, I believe that caring and confrontation equals growth in understanding and a pathway to peace and justice. Justice and love are the key ingredients to peace in our world. Justice without love is simply legalism. And love without justice is only sentimentality and not love. And so we really need to be people. We need to be involved. We need to be seekers after justice. And we have to do it in a way that demonstrates true compassion and love in our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the learned speakers. We open the floor now for discussion. We have had, I think, enough participation from the right side. Now we would like to have participation from the left side. The Jewish point of view was criticized by the writers. The Christian point of view may now be attacked, quote unquote, by the lefters. Can we have somebody from here? Your Excellency, would you initiate? You can take the initiative. As you like. Yes, please.
I wanted to ask President Markham about both the Inquisition and the Crusades, how those came about, these two positions on Christianity.
It's always very important to stress, whenever you're talking about theology, that many people of all faith traditions are very good at ignoring everything their tradition teaches. And you give them two very good illustrations of acts in the Bible Christian Church which were shameful and completely and utterly wrong, and a complete betrayal of everything that the tradition teaches. How do I explain that? Well, it is true that the themes of a religious tradition can be used in the service of other ends, political or economic, and when that happens, then often the ideals of that tradition are ignored and abused and exploited. The Crusades were an un-Christian act and just wrong, and they should not happen.
Yes, please.
My name is Mahbub Chowdhury. Thank you very much for a detailed introduction of Christianity. I understood that religion is a source of peace and justice. But in the present scenario, you see, when we see the ground reality, it looks that religion has become a source of conflict. Especially after 9/11, you see the first few speeches of George Bush, they disturbed the whole situation of where peace building work was being done. And same in the countries where they are dominated by Islamic values, their interpretation of jihad is twisted and given some other, you see, meanings and understandings. We like to comment, how can we prove, you see, even after 2000 years, we did not act upon, or we did not, you see, practice those values which were taught by the religion 2000 years before. That is justice, peace, love, freedom, and equality.
I'll let Ralph comment on this, given that he focused on the American scene. I'll just make one quick comment. I'm not an American. I live and work in America, and I can't vote in American elections, and I'm not a supporter of George W. Bush. But I will say this, and that is that from his perception, he does think that his actions are compatible with the just war tradition. He thinks that the war on terror is an act of self-defense because of the September 11. He thinks that the technological advances militarily are being used in a discriminating way. And he thinks this is the only way forward. Now, you can disagree with all that, and I disagree with much of it, but that's what he would say.
Until very recently, as I said, we've been a nation of isolation from most of the world, and our people have been, although, well, for example, in the 1950s, a book was published by Will Herberg entitled Protestant, Christian, and Jew. In other words, to be an American, it was considered necessary to be one of those three, to be a legitimate American. Of course, that's changed, and it's changing dramatically, but there's still an information. I think we fear what we don't know, and many Americans today don't know very much about Islam. And so the great need in our nation is to bring people of goodwill and understanding to talk together so that that fear lessens. In terms of of our American policies, I think our nation is very much divided. And a great many of us, while respecting George Bush as our president and believing that he does, I think he believes he's acting in the best interests of the United States, many of us don't think he is and kind of and oppose his policies. I find it interesting. There's a group in America that's called the True Majority. And I was showing some of my friends this educational device. But you see, if you can see this, it talks about our global military spending in the United States. And you see, it shows that, for example, the United States and its allies spend $548 billion on military preparations, while Russia spends $60 billion, China 42, and everybody else, or the axis of evil, spends 12. So when you look at the proportion, you can see the proportion of money spent on military. You see how way out of balance the American situation is. On the other side, this is federal spending. And federal spending in terms of the Pentagon is $343 billion that we spend on the Pentagon, which is largely military. We spend $39 billion on children's health in the United States, $34 billion on education, $6 billion on Head Start, which is a program to help young people, children, move ahead. A minuscule amount on reduction of reliance on oil, and only $1 billion on world hunger, which is service to a needy world. So we got $343 billion versus spending on military preparedness and $1 billion on world hunger. So we're not fulfilling our mandate as Christians, as Christians in that regard.
Sorry for intervention. Now this 340 has risen to 400.
Right, you are.
Dr. Anis wants, yeah, please you first.
Ian, were you going to say more?
No.
I have a question I'd like to address to Ian and then to either or both of you, a second question. I'd like Ian to address for this group the differences between Christianity prior to secularism, because I think that is a key departure point and may explain a lot of why the true Christian tradition is really not followed by the West. And I think in the Muslim world, we hear a lot of attack on Christians and the Christian West, but in fact, the West is not very Christian at all due to secularism, and what the implications of that are for the world and for global peace and justice. My second question is on the application of liberation theology and its contribution to efforts toward peace and justice, peace based on justice, and what chance it might have in the secularized West from your